Let's get into R. Kelly's trial in New York. But first, I'm going to give y'all my disclaimer. This is commentary to me, and commentary only. Nothing more or nothing less. I don't know which part of this is worse. The facts of the matter are, regardless of all the exaggerated lies from the media and the accusers, R. Kelly still engaged in inappropriate behavior with minors for years. That was him on tape with Rishana Landfair. And he married Aaliyah when she was underage with the help of his employees and government officials. I cannot understand why people are still in denial. People that weren't in the surviving R. Kelly documentary will be testifying against R. Kelly's behavior during this trial. And these are facts.
The following program is intended for mature audiences.
During day 3 of the R. Kelly trial, one of the things the jury heard was that the late singer, Aaliyah, illegally married Kelly in Chicago in 1994. For the first time, jurors saw the marriage license for R. Kelly and Aaliyah. At the time, he was 27 of age, and she was 15, but marriage documents falsely said she was 18. Prosecutors called Carolyn Harris, a Cook County court clerk for 21 years, in the department that issues birth, marriage, and death records. She testified that anyone seeking to marry at that time in Cook County had to show valid ID and be at least 18. If they were younger, they had to be accompanied by a parent. The prosecution introduced as evidence the application for marriage, the marriage license, and the certificate of marriage involving Kelly and Aaliyah, all of which were closely examined. She said the bride was listed as Aaliyah D. Horton, with a birth date of January 16, 1976. Aaliyah actually was born on the same date, but in 1979. According to Harris, the type of ID presented for Aaliyah, according to the document, was from the Department of Public Aid. The date of the application was August 30, 1994, and its effective date, meaning the earliest date they could marry, was August 31, 1994. On cross-examination, Harris said she was not the clerk who handled the Kelly and Aaliyah marriage documents in 1994. Later, the prosecution called Demetrius Smith, who described himself as an assistant and tour manager for Kelly between 1984 and 1996. He testified under subpoena and immunity from prosecution. It's reported that Smith turned out to be a cranky witness. He appeared uncooperative on the stand, saying he didn't remember some things that took place. Prosecutors then would remind him of what he said in his grand jury testimony, making him read from a transcript. He was even reprimanded by the judge repeatedly for over-talking her and the prosecutors. At one point, Smith complained that he felt as if he was on trial for Aaliyah. By the end of day, it's said that he was very tense on the stand. He said, "I'm truly uncomfortable with this, Your Honor. We're continuously talking about Aaliyah, and her parents aren't here." This did not sway prosecutors from continuing on with their line of questioning. When he somewhat composed himself and was able to recall events, Smith told a mudding and conflicting story. Under prosecution questioning, Smith claimed that Daryl McDavid, Kelly's accountant and manager, arranged the illegal marriage to Aaliyah. Smith said he thought it was a bad idea because she was underage, but wanted to stay in the loop. So he offered to help get Aaliyah a false ID by bribing a welfare office worker with $500 in cash. He said Aaliyah went with him to the welfare office to have her picture taken for the ID. He said she didn't fill out any paperwork, and the ID did not have her age. Smith said he thought she needed another form of ID. So he described going to a courier-type shipping store to get a work ID. When it came to describing what happened, when they went to get the marriage documents, Smith faltered and had to read his own grand jury testimony out loud for everyone to hear. He read that officials at the county clerk's office denied her application because there was no age on her false IDs. But Smith said McDavid then allegedly stepped in and pulled some strings so they could get a marriage license. He said he didn't really know how McDavid allegedly made that happen. Smith said Aaliyah was the niece of Kelly's then tour manager, Barry Hankerson, who introduced Kelly to her and her family in Detroit so he could hear Aaliyah sing. Smith said Hankerson told him she was 14 or 15 at the time. Later, Kelly became Aaliyah's mentor and the producer and writer of her first album. The name of the album, titled Age Ain't Nothing But a Number, was released in May 1994. Smith described himself becoming concerned about Kelly's too friendly behavior with Aaliyah. Then while on tour with Kelly, the singer would tell him Aaliyah is in trouble and they needed to get home. Smith testified that while on the plane home to Chicago, Kelly told Smith that Aaliyah thinks she's pregnant. He said McDavid was making arrangements for Aaliyah to marry Kelly so that she could protect him. The prosecution would then ask Smith, protection from what? To which Smith replied, I guess jail. The focus on Aaliyah, who died in a 2001 plane crash, is important because prosecutors have charged that Kelly had sexual contact with the singer, known as Jane Doe No. 1 in the indictment, and that she was underage at the time that Kelly believed she became pregnant. Prosecutors argue he secretly arranged the marriage by allegedly getting a member of his entourage to bribe a government official in Chicago. They did this in order to obtain a fake ID, in order to protect himself from criminal charges. Because according to the law, a wife can't be forced to testify against her husband. The outline of the story of Kelly and Aaliyah has long been known. Although Kelly has never admitted to wrongdoing, the marriage was soon annulled. In her opening statement on Wednesday, Kelly's defense lawyer, Nicole Blankbecker, said there is no evidence to prove Aaliyah was pregnant, noting that she obviously cannot testify herself as she's not alive to do so. Aaliyah, God rest her soul, passed away, Becker would explain to the court. If Mr. Kelly was involved in a crime in 1994, would we be here today? Despite defense efforts to keep it out, U.S. District Judge Ann Donnelly ruled that the issue of the alleged illegal marriage would be allowed in at the trial. She said that it was clearly relevant and it clearly shows a motive for Racketeering Act No. 1, so it is admissible. A man who worked for Kelly as an alleged runner testified under subpoena for the prosecution and described Kelly's home as a strange place. He told the jury that Kelly's girls and girlfriends had to get permission for most things. This was under Kelly's rules. He testified he often saw women and the young girls, but he wasn't allowed to talk to them. Between 2007 and 2009, Anthony Navarro worked for Kelly in his Chicago area home studio, carrying out such duties as answering the phone, picking up food and guests, and driving them to the airport or around town. Navarro's testimony appeared aimed at supporting some of the prosecutor's sex trafficking and racketeering charges placed against Kelly. The charges describe the singer as the head of a criminal enterprise of managers, bodyguards, and other assistants, who allegedly helped Kelly to recruit women and underage girls for sex and pornography, and to cross state lines for that purpose. Prosecutors asked Navarro who were the guests at Kelly's house. He said they were girlfriends of Rob. They then asked who was he driving during his driving runs, to which he replied, mainly it was girls. They wore street clothes if they were going to outside locations, but they would be in pajamas type of clothing if they were going to Kelly's house. The girls had to get permission for most things, according to Navarro. When he went on tour with Kelly, he and other members of Kelly's entourage would invite people to after-parties following concerts. They would hand out handwritten pieces of paper with Kelly's phone number. Navarro said, they would hand them out in the crowd, at malls, and restaurants. On cross-examination, defense lawyer Becker asked Navarro if women would wait in the studio for hours. He replied, sometimes, yes. Were they free to leave if they wanted to? Navarro replied, yes. Could they wait days? Navarro replied, yes. He went on to say he didn't know the details of the women's visits. Becker then asked Navarro if he ever heard the girls at the house call R. Kelly, Daddy. Navarro said, yes. She then asked, Becker went on to ask if people requesting to leave the house were forbidden to do so. Navarro said there have been times when people wanted to leave and they couldn't, citing reasons such as a ride wasn't available or they couldn't get in touch with Kelly, but they could walk out the door. She asked did he ever see Kelly armed. Navarro said no. Did you ever see any physical abuse at the studio? Navarro said, no. Did you ever see Kelly having sex in the studio? Navarro said, no. Did you ever see verbal abuse in the studio? Navarro said, yes. Becker pointed out that he told prosecutors in February 2020 that he never saw physical or verbal abuse in the studio. She then asked, were there times employees were reprimanded? Navarro said, yes. On redirect, Assistant U.S. Attorney Elizabeth Geddes asked Navarro to compare his time working for Kelly with his other music industry experiences. He replied, it was a weird time for me. The things you had to do were just a bit uncomfortable. It was almost like the Twilight Zone. You went into the gate, and it was like a different world, just a strange place. R. Kelly's primary care doctor, Chris McGraw, also testified under subpoena on Thursday that he was Kelly's doctor for 25 years, until 2019. He also testified that he was a social friend who visited his home sometimes for social events like parties and dinners. McGraw said he diagnosed Kelly with genital herpes. He informed Kelly and told him to tell his sexual partners. He said he'd been prescribing Voltrex for Kelly since at least 2007, but could not say specifically when he concluded Kelly actually had herpes. The doctor told jurors that he first became aware of the possibility Kelly might have herpes much earlier, as a June 5, 2000 visit. McGraw said he called to request a prescription for what he called the blue pill. The phone calls seemed to be frequent for the blue pills. Kelly called so often for medication that McGraw eventually memorized the singer's phone number. McGraw eventually told Kelly to take the pills daily. The pharmacy he worked at was also near a McDonald's, where Kelly allegedly met one of his accusers. Prosecutors' questioning on Kelly's apparent herpes was to establish that he was well aware of his diagnosis, and that he gave it to partners without telling them. But Kelly's attorneys had argued herpes is not life-threatening, so Kelly shouldn't be charged with passing it on to a minor. They specifically argued the herpes exposure charge should be dropped because herpes is a virus and not an acute bacterial venereal disease, such as syphilis or gonorrhea. They also argued that racketeering charges should also be dismissed because they said they fell outside the 5-year statute of limitations. On cross-examination, defense attorney Nicole Blank Becker tried to challenge McGraw on the nature of herpes. She asked, "You can say 100% he has herpes?" McGraw answered, "I feel that 100% he has herpes." She then asked, "Are you saying, as in, I feel like it's freezing in here?" McGraw responded, "I believe that 100%, based on his exam, the treatment that he had, and the response to therapy." Becker then asked, "Can't you use the herpes meds to treat other things?" The doctor would repeat the word 3 times to drive home his point. Herpes herpes, herpes. Roger Canoff, a former assistant district attorney in New York City, shared his thoughts on the doctor's testimony with CNN. He said, "It is difficult to prove, because it is not easy to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant knew he was infected when the sexual intercourse took place." However, testimony from a doctor who was treating Kelly is damning evidence. It shows that as far back as 2007, Kelly knew he had a venereal disease. If it can be proven that he knew, and that he continued to have sexual intercourse, then the offense can be proven against him. McGrath also testified that while Kelly had health insurance, he never paid him for his medical services during the decades he treated him. The singer would, however, invite him and his wife to parties, dinners, and pay for his flights to concerts. The government accuses Kelly of leading a criminal enterprise of managers, bodyguards, and other employees who allegedly helped Kelly to recruit women and underage girls for sex and pornography, and to cross state lines for that purpose. Kelly is also accused in the 2-year-old indictment of bribery, kidnapping, forced labor, producing child pornography, and knowingly infecting some victims with a sexually transmitted disease. Kelly has pleaded not guilty to all the charges.